"I don't deserve you, Opal." The words fell from Oliver Hadley's mouth like stones dropped into a dry well, heavy, final, swallowed by darkness before they ever hit bottom. "I never did." Opal Dawson did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford, not in this life, not in this territory, not with a man who kept choosing his demons over her light. She stood in the doorway of the small clapboard house at the edge of Redemption Creek, her dark hair unraveling from its pins, her green eyes holding something far more dangerous than grief. She held those eyes steady on Oliver's face, on the hard line of his jaw, on the guilty slant of his shoulders, on all the magnificent ruin of a man who had spent 3 years dismantling himself in front of her. "You're right," she said quietly, and the quietness of it made him flinch harder than a shout ever could have. "You don't." Oliver's throat worked. He looked like a man who had prepared himself for a bullet and received a blade instead, slower, more precise, more personal. He pressed his hat against his chest, his knuckles white around the brim. "Then I ought to ride out," he said. "Let you find someone who, Oliver Hadley." Opal's voice cut through the hot Kansas air like a wire pulled taut. She stepped fully into the doorway, and the afternoon sun caught the copper threads in her hair and made her look, God help him, like something that had been forged rather than born. "If you ride out that gate, it will be the last decision you ever make as a coward, and I will not mourn a coward. I will be furious at one." She paused, and in that pause the whole world seemed to hold its breath, the dust, the distant cattle, the lonesome cry of a hawk circling above the ridge. "You said you don't deserve me. Fine, I believe you, but I am not asking you to deserve me right now. I am telling you to earn it." The silence that followed those words was enormous. Oliver stared at her. Opal Dawson stared back. And somewhere inside the wreckage of Oliver Hadley, something that had been lying flat and buried for a very long time struggled upright. It had not always been this way between them. It had not always been confrontations on doorsteps and men with hats pressed to their chests and women with fire burning behind controlled green eyes. There had been a before, a quieter, stranger, more tentative before. And if you wanted to understand how two people arrived at this precise moment of reckoning in the summer of 1882 in Redemption Creek, Kansas, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the train. Opal Dawson had arrived in Redemption Creek on the 14th of April, 1882, on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, carrying one carpetbag, a leather-bound journal, and a letter of introduction from the Dawson family attorney in St. Louis, addressed to a Mr. Gerald Whitmore, who was supposed to be waiting on the platform to receive her. Gerald Whitmore was not waiting on the platform. What was waiting on the platform was a yellow dog, an overturned flour sack, and Oliver Hadley, who had been tasked with collecting a shipment of fencing wire from the freight car, and had no idea that the woman now descending the train steps with the posture of a queen and the expression of someone prepared to be deeply disappointed, was about to become the most disruptive force in his ordered, solitary, carefully constructed life. Oliver noticed her the way you notice a storm front on the horizon, not with particular alarm at first, just with the automatic awareness of something significant approaching. She was tall for a woman, with strong hands and a straight spine, and she looked around the platform of Redemption Creek with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who was taking inventory rather than sightseeing. He touched the brim of his hat out of habit and went back to arguing with the freight clerk about whether 30 coils of wire constituted one shipment or two. Opal stood on that platform for 20 minutes. No Gerald Whitmore appeared. The train pulled out of the station with a great exhalation of steam, and suddenly the platform was empty except for Opal Dawson, Oliver Hadley, the yellow dog, and the scattered flour. "Excuse me." Her voice was clear and even. "Do you know a man named Gerald Whitmore?" Oliver turned. Up close she was more everything, more present, more sharp-eyed, more undeniably a person with a complete interior life that was not inclined to wait for anyone's convenience. He noted all of this in approximately 4 seconds and then answered honestly. "Whitmore passed away 3 weeks ago," he said. Hart gave out, "I'm sorry. Did you know him well?" Something crossed her face, not grief exactly, but a rapid recalculation. He saw her absorbing the information and rearranging the furniture of her situation around it with an efficiency that impressed him despite himself. "He was going to employ me," she said carefully. "I was coming to work as a teacher. He had written to say the town needed a school teacher and that he would arrange housing." Oliver looked at her. He looked at the carpetbag. He looked at the town of Redemption Creek spread behind him, which was not large by anyone's measure, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a church, a smithy, a bank, and a scattering of houses that ranged from modest to optimistic. "The church runs the school," he said. "Reverend Alcott might know about a housing arrangement. Then I suppose I should speak to Reverend Alcott." "I suppose you should." She looked at him steadily. He looked at her steadily back. The yellow dog sat down between them and yawned. "I'm Oliver Hadley," he said, because it seemed like the thing to do. "I run the Double H spread about 4 miles west of town." "Opal Dawson," she said. "I'm from St. Louis." "I can tell." She raised an eyebrow. It was a very effective eyebrow. "Is that a criticism, Mr. Hadley?" "No, ma'am, just an observation." There was a pause that was not quite awkward and not quite comfortable. A pause that was, in retrospect, entirely characteristic of everything that came after, because Oliver Hadley and Opal Dawson existed on either side of a tension that had no clean name. It was not hostility. It was not flirtation, not yet. It was the recognition, animal and instinctive, that the other person was not going to be easy or simple or ignorable. He walked her to Reverend Alcott's because the alternative was leaving her on the platform with the yellow dog, and whatever Oliver Hadley was, he was not the kind of man who did that. Reverend Alcott was a small, serious man with spectacles and a genuine commitment to literacy. He had indeed been informed that a teacher was coming. He had arranged a room at the Callaway boarding house for her. The school, a one-room building behind the church, was in desperate need of someone qualified to run it, as the previous teacher had departed in February after marrying a cattle rancher from Abilene. "You are more than welcome, Miss Dawson," the Reverend said. "The children need instruction and the community needs someone with dedication." Opal looked at the schoolroom. She looked at the cracked window pane, the leaning bookshelves, the mismatched chairs. She looked at the Reverend. She looked briefly at Oliver Hadley, who had followed her in and was now standing against the wall with his hat in his hands for the second time that day, which was beginning to feel less like a courtesy and more like a habit. "I can begin on Monday," she said. Oliver Hadley walked back to where his wagon was loaded with fencing wire and drove the 4 miles west to the Double H. And he did not think about Opal Dawson, except in the way that you do not think about a new sound in the house constantly, and with the low-grade alertness of someone waiting to understand what it means. The Double H had belonged to Oliver's father before it belonged to Oliver, and before that it had been raw Kansas grassland with nothing on it but wind and buffalo grass and the occasional prairie dog. His father, Thomas Hadley, had broken the ground and raised the house and built the cattle operation from absolutely nothing, and Oliver had grown up watching a man work himself into the shape of the land until the two were almost indistinguishable. Thomas Hadley had died when Oliver was 22, leaving him a working ranch, a modest debt, and a warning. "This land will take everything you give it and ask for more. Don't let it be the only thing you love." Oliver was 28 now, and he had, with remarkable consistency, done exactly what his father told him not to do. The Double H had consumed him. He had a foreman named Chet Briggs who had been with the ranch for 6 years and 2 ranch hands, a young man named Denny, and an older drifter called Sampson who had shown up one spring asking for work and simply never left. The ranch ran well. The cattle were healthy. Oliver's life was orderly and efficient, and almost entirely empty of anything that could not be measured in head count or acreage. He was not a man who thought of himself as lonely. He was a man who had decided that certain things were not available to him and had arranged himself accordingly. There was a reason for this arrangement. There was always a reason, and the reason, like all the worst reasons, had a name. The name was William Creed, but that was not a story Oliver Hadley told anyone, and in the spring of 1882, with the grass coming in green and the fence line needing repair, he had made his peace with the silence around it. Or so he believed. The first time Oliver and Opal spoke at length was a Thursday in late April, 3 weeks after her arrival. He had come into town for supplies and found her at the general store, run by a man named Fenton, arguing politely, but with increasing precision about whether the order of primers she had placed could be fulfilled by the following week or whether Fenton's estimate of sometime in June was negotiable. "The school year does not have the luxury of waiting for June," she was saying when Oliver pushed through the door. "The children are behind. Some of them are 12 years old and cannot read past a basic primer. Every week matters." Fenton, a round, good-natured man who genuinely liked Opal but was also genuinely uncertain about his supply line, spread his hands. "Miss Dawson, I understand the urgency, but the distributor in Wichita, I can take a wagon to Wichita," Oliver heard himself say. Both of them turned. He had not planned to say it. It had simply emerged, fully formed, from some region of himself that apparently made decisions without consulting the rest of him. Fenton looked relieved. Opal looked at Oliver with those assessing green eyes. "I have business in Wichita next week," he added, because now that he had committed to the statement he might as well give it some architecture. "I could carry an order for the school. Wouldn't be any trouble. I couldn't impose on you, Mr. Hadley," she said, and she said it in the tone that meant she was considering whether she could impose on him and was waiting for more information before deciding. "It's not an imposition. The wagon has room." She studied him for another moment. He bore the study as calmly as he could, which was to say that he was very still and hoped his face was not doing anything revealing. "That's very kind of you," she said finally. "Thank you." He went to Wichita on the following Tuesday. She had given him a precise written list, the specific titles of primers, the quantities, the edition numbers. He found the list somewhat remarkable. It was the list of a person who had thought carefully about what children actually needed to learn and in what sequence, which suggested she was genuinely good at her job, which was a quality Oliver Hadley had always respected above most others. He brought back every item on the list. When he delivered the books to the schoolroom, Opal was sweeping the floor, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair in a plain braid down her back. She looked up when he came in with the first armload, and for a moment her face did something unguarded, a flash of pure delight at the sight of the primers, before she collected herself. "You got all of them," she said. "You gave me a good list." She smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was the real kind, the kind that reached the eyes and did something to the entire face. Oliver Hadley set down the books and told himself that the warmth he felt was simply satisfaction at a task completed. He did not entirely believe himself. The summer of 1882 moved across the Kansas prairie, the way summers did out there, slowly, and with great heat, and the particular quality of light that turned everything golden and merciless in equal measure. Opal Dawson settled into Redemption Creek like she had always been there, and also like she was constantly about to improve it. She organized the school. She established a lending library of sorts in the back corner of the church, negotiating with Reverend Alcott to give up 2 shelves that had previously held hymnals no one used. She wrote letters to the territorial government in Topeka about funding for a second classroom. She taught 6 days a week and spent her Sundays riding or walking the prairie trails north of town, and she was, by general consensus, the best thing that had happened to Redemption Creek's children since the founding of the church school. Oliver found reasons to be in town more than he had been before. He was aware that this was happening. He chose to characterize it as coincidence, until the coincidences accumulated into something that even his considerable capacity for self-deception could not sustain. He brought her books from Wichita when he went. She gave him her opinions on the books with a directness that he found bracing and occasionally annoying, which was itself a form of pleasure because almost no one was direct with Oliver Hadley about anything. They were careful with him the way people were careful around a man with a reputation they couldn't quite parse. She was not careful. "I think you're hiding," she told him one evening in late June. They were sitting on the steps of the church after a town meeting, the rest of the community drifting home in the blue summer dusk. He had said something. He could not afterward remember exactly what about preferring the ranch to company. He looked at her. "Beg your pardon. You're an intelligent man who has chosen to remove himself from almost everything. That's either wisdom or hiding, and you don't strike me as a man given to pure wisdom." She said it without cruelty, the way you might observe that the sky was likely to rain. "Miss Dawson," he said, "you've known me approximately 2 months." "I know," she said pleasantly. "I might be wrong." He was quiet for a long time. The cicadas were loud in the grass. "What if you're right?" he said finally, and then was surprised at himself for saying it. She looked at him with those steady eyes. "Then I think you should stop," she said. "Whatever you're hiding from, I think you should stop." Oliver Hadley looked out at the dark silhouette of the Kansas prairie and thought about William Creed, which was not something he normally permitted himself to do in the presence of other people. He thought about the thing that had happened 4 years ago in a town called Galloway, 60 miles south. He thought about a secret that had the weight and shape of a buried man. "Some things can't be walked away from," he said. "Not cleanly." Opal was quiet beside him. She did not press. She had the rare quality of knowing when a silence was not an invitation but a door, and that pushing a door was different from waiting for it to open. It was this quality, more than any other, that was going to undo him. July brought heat and a dispute between 2 neighboring ranchers, the Hollies brothers, over water rights to a creek that ran along their shared boundary line. Oliver was not involved in the dispute, but Sheriff Ben Aldrich asked him to mediate because Oliver was, as Aldrich put it, one of the few men in this county that both sides will sit still for. Oliver did not want to mediate. He did it anyway because that was also characteristic of him, the reluctant doing of necessary things. He told Opal about the mediation over supper at the boarding house one evening, having been invited by Mrs. Calloway, who ran a table for her boarders on Wednesdays and occasionally invited ranchers from outside of town when she had too much food and not enough conversation. "You resolved it," Opal said. "How?" "Proposed a shared easement with specific seasonal terms. Holly's brothers both got something they could point to as a victory. You made each of them feel they won, more or less." She looked at him thoughtfully. "That requires a great deal of understanding of what each person actually needs as opposed to what they say they want." "I've spent a lot of time around cattle," he said. "Cattle are not so different." She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised out of her, and it changed her face into something that had no guardedness in it at all. Oliver Hadley experienced approximately 3 seconds of being entirely unprepared for the effect of that laugh on his internal composition, and then excused himself to help Mrs. Calloway carry dishes. He was falling for her and he knew it, and he did not know what to do with it because of William Creed, and because of what Oliver Hadley knew about himself and what he had done and what he was, and was not in a position to offer anyone. It was in August that things shifted. A man rode into Redemption Creek on a gray horse, a lean man with a marshal's badge and cold eyes, asking questions. His name was Deputy Marshal Cole Farrow, and he was out of the Federal Circuit Court in Topeka, and he was looking for information about an unsolved matter involving a man named William Creed who had died in the town of Galloway, Kansas, in the spring of 1878. Oliver heard about the deputy's arrival from Chet Briggs, who had been in town for supplies. He stood in the middle of the yard of the Double H for a long moment after Chet rode away, the Kansas sun pressing down on him like a judgment, and then he went into the house and sat down at his father's old desk and looked at the far wall for a very long time. William Creed had been a man who hurt people. That was the simple version of the truth, and it was also an incomplete version, because simple versions of that kind of truth always were. Creed had run a protection scheme out of Galloway, extracting money from small homesteaders and farmers with a combination of legal manipulation and the threat of violence. He had a network of men, not outlaws exactly, but men willing to lean hard on people who couldn't fight back. Oliver Hadley had been 24 in 1878. He had gone to Galloway to try to recover money that Creed's operation had taken from a neighbor of the Double H, an older widow named Mrs. Enright whose farm was failing under Creed's demands. He had gone alone and without a plan, which was a reflection of how young 24 was, and what had happened was not what he intended. Creed had confronted him. There had been a fight. It had taken place in a barn at the edge of Galloway at night, and in the dark and the chaos of it, Creed had fallen, had struck his head on the corner of a water trough with a sound that Oliver had never in 4 years been able to stop hearing. Oliver had run. That was the fact that lived in him like a splinter. He had run because he was young and frightened, and because Creed had men in town who would not look charitably on what had just occurred, and running had been the instinctive and cowardly choice, and he had lived with it ever since. He had never been sure whether he was legally responsible for Creed's death. The man had been violent, the confrontation had begun as self-defense, but Oliver had run and had never come forward and had spent 4 years building a quiet life on top of that hidden fact. Deputy Marshal Farrow was in Redemption Creek for 3 days. He spoke to the sheriff. He spoke to several townspeople. He came out to the Double H on the 2nd day and spoke to Oliver, asking whether he had known a William Creed, whether he had ever traveled to Galloway, whether he had any information about the matter. Oliver answered carefully. He said he had heard of Creed by reputation. He said he had been in Galloway once, years ago. He did not say anything that was a direct lie, but he did not say anything that was the whole truth, and when Farrow rode away on the 3rd day, Oliver sat back down at his father's desk and understood something precise about himself. He was a man building a present on top of a buried past, and the building was not stable. He did not tell Opal about any of it. What happened instead was that through August and into September, something continued to grow between them that was becoming impossible to ignore. They walked. They talked. They argued about books and about the territorial government's indifference to frontier schools, and about whether a man could truly know his own character, or whether character was only revealed by circumstance. Oliver Hadley held his dark past inside him like a coal carried in a closed fist, warm and burning and invisible, and he was charming and careful and present with Opal, and he told himself that this was enough, that he was not deceiving her because she had not asked the right questions. In early October, Opal asked him to supper, not at Mrs. Calloway's table, but in the small sitting room of her rooms at the boarding house, where she had obtained permission from Mrs. Calloway to cook on the small wood stove. She made a roast rabbit with dried herbs and cornbread, which was a better meal than Oliver had eaten in quite some time, and they sat across the small table from each other in the lamplight, and the domesticity of it struck him with a force that was almost physical. "You look like a man thinking something difficult," she observed. "I look like that a lot." "You do," she agreed. "But tonight it's different." He looked at her across the lamp. The light was amber and soft, and she was everything, was the honest answer, was every argument against his careful self-isolation, was exactly the thing he had told himself was not available to him, and was sitting right across a small wooden table being entirely, inconveniently real. "Opal," he said, and then stopped. She waited. He tried again. "I find that he was not a man who stumbled over words." He found this particular stumbling mortifying and somehow also appropriate. "I have come to think a great deal of you, more than a great deal." He watched her face do something careful and deliberate, the way a person controls their reaction when they are surprised by how much something matters to them. "Oliver," she said quietly. "I know I have no particular right to." "Don't do that," she said. "Don't make it smaller by apologizing before you've even finished saying it." He stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him with those direct green eyes and something that was, unmistakably and without any hedging, warmth. "I have come to think a great deal of you too," she said. "Quite considerably more than a great deal." In October of 1882, on the Kansas prairie, Oliver Hadley and Opal Dawson arrived at the understanding that they were in love with each other cautiously, carefully, with a considerable amount of unspoken history on his side, and a woman's clear-eyed awareness on hers that she was dealing with a man who had not yet decided whether he deserved to be loved. He walked her home from the school twice a week. He arrived at her door on Saturday evenings. They went to church on Sundays, which Oliver had not done consistently since his father died, and sat in the second pew and sang hymns with the slightly self-conscious effort of two people who were aware of the community's benevolent observation. Mrs. Calloway told Reverend Alcott it was the most pleasant courtship she had witnessed in 15 years. Sheriff Aldrich told his deputy that it was about time Oliver Hadley stopped using that ranch as a private monastery. Chet Briggs said nothing, but started laying extra wood by the fireplace at the Double H without being asked, which was his way of acknowledging that winter was coming and that certain things were changing. They kissed for the first time in November, on the porch of the boarding house in the first cold of the season, the sky enormous and black and salted with stars. It was brief and a little tentative, and then less tentative, and then entirely certain. And afterward Opal pressed her forehead against his shoulder, and he stood very still with his arms around her, and thought that he had no right to this and could not make himself let go. November was when things began to fracture. It started with a letter. Oliver received it on a Tuesday, a letter postmarked from Galloway, written in a hand he did not recognize. It was short. It said, "I know what happened to William Creed. I know you were there. You have until December 1st to come to Galloway and present yourself to Marshal Farrow, who will return to take your statement. If you do not, I will provide my account to the authorities myself." It was unsigned. Oliver read it twice, then folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat and drove to town to see Opal, and found he could not look at her directly. She noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. They were standing in the schoolroom after the children had left for the day, the late November light coming in gray through the repaired windows. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him with that patient, terrible accuracy she possessed. "Oliver," she said, "I'm fine." He said it in a voice that was perfectly calibrated to close the conversation, and he watched something go a little careful in her eyes, a slight withdrawal, not dramatic but precise, the way a flame reduces when a door is opened and the air changes. "All right," she said quietly, and went back to the lesson books. He drove home in the dark and sat at his father's desk and looked at the letter for a long time. The question before him was straightforward in structure and impossible in execution. He could go to Galloway and present himself to Marshal Farrow, which would mean telling the truth about what had happened that night in the barn, which might result in a legal proceeding against him, which might mean a trial, which might mean prison, which might mean losing the ranch and losing everything he had built, and the thought landed like a boot heel, losing Opal. Or he could not go, wait for the anonymous sender to report him, and face the same consequences from a worse position, without the moral credit of having come forward voluntarily. Or he could tell Opal. He sat with that third option for a long time. He did not choose it, not yet. He chose instead the oldest and most destructive strategy available to a man with a secret, which was to pull back incrementally, and hope the situation resolved itself without requiring him to be entirely honest with the person he loved. December arrived cold and clear and merciless. Opal noticed the distance. She was too intelligent not to. She asked him twice, directly, what was troubling him, and both times he deflected with such practiced ease that he hated himself for it. She did not push, that was not her way, but he could feel the quality of her patience changing, moving from trust into something more watchful. She was beginning to calculate. On the 7th of December, Chet Briggs came to find him in the barn with a grave expression. "There's a federal deputy in town again, boss," Chet said. "Same one as before, Farrow. He's asking at the sheriff's office." Oliver went still. He had not gone to Galloway. He had failed to make that choice, and now the choice was being made for him. He put down the harness he had been mending. He looked at his hands, which were steady, which was more than he deserved. He thought about his father's warning. This land will take everything you give it and ask for more. Don't let it be the only thing you love, and understood with sudden painful clarity that his father had been right about everything, including this. He went to Redemption Creek. He went to see Opal first, because whatever happened next, she deserved to hear it from him before she heard it from anyone else. That was the minimum, and Oliver Hadley was going to meet the minimum even if he was too late to meet anything higher. She was at the schoolroom. The children had gone. She was writing on the blackboard, her back to the door. He came in and she turned, and whatever was in his face told her immediately that this was not a regular visit. She set down the chalk. "Sit down," she said, and her voice was careful. "I'll stand," he said. "I won't be long." "Oliver, please." He pressed his hat between his hands. He told her. He told her all of it: Galloway, Creed, the barn, the fall, the running, the 4 years of silence, the deputy's first visit, the letter, December 1st, the failure to act. He told her in the flat, even voice of a man reporting facts about another man he was not proud of but had to account for, and he did not stop until there was nothing left to say. The silence that followed was very long. Opal stood very still. Her face had gone through several things while he spoke. He watched it happen, watched the pieces of her understanding of him rearrange themselves around this new information, watched the warmth not disappear exactly but shift into something more complicated, more guarded. "You let me believe," she said finally, "that I knew you." "You do know me," he said. "I know the version of you that decided what I was allowed to know." There was no yelling in her. There was something much worse. There was the cool, devastating clarity of a woman who had been treated as less than she was. "I know the version of you that smiled and walked me home and sat in church with me and kissed me and let me—" She stopped. When she continued, her voice was precisely controlled. "You let me fall in love with a man who was not showing me the whole of himself. That is a form of deception, Oliver. You understand that." He did not argue. There was no argument available. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to go speak to Deputy Farrow," he said. "Tell him what happened, all of it. I should have done it 4 years ago. I should have done it when he came the first time." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He stood in the quiet schoolroom and looked at the woman he loved and understood that he was going to lose her, and that this was an entirely logical consequence of choices he had made, and that logic did not make it any less like being gutted. "I don't deserve you," he said. The words came out heavy and final, and he meant every syllable. "I never did." Opal held his gaze. He watched her wrestle with it, really wrestle, not performing composure but actually working through something difficult and honest in front of him. "You're right," she said quietly. "You don't." He started to say he ought to ride out. He had gotten precisely to the word coward when she said it, when she told him he had better earn it then. And the words landed in the center of his chest like a key turning a lock that had been rusted shut for 4 years. He stood on her doorstep in the winter light of Redemption Creek and felt something that was not hope exactly. Hope was too light a word, but was the first motion toward it. The first credible motion toward something that was not hiding. "How?" he asked. Because that was the question, and she was the only person whose answer he trusted. "Go talk to Farrow," she said. "Tell the truth, all of it, and then we'll see." He nodded. He put his hat on his head. He turned to go. "Oliver," he stopped. "I did not say it was over." Her voice was not soft exactly, but it was real, and that realness steadied him. "I said earn it." He went to the sheriff's office. Deputy Marshal Farrow was a methodical man with thin features and the eyes of someone who had spent years listening to people explain themselves. He listened to Oliver for a long time without interruption. He took notes in a small leather book. He asked 3 or 4 careful questions. He did not express an opinion. He said he would need to file a full report with the circuit court, and that Oliver might be required to provide a formal deposition, and that the matter would be reviewed by the circuit judge. Sheriff Aldrich, who had known Oliver Hadley for 6 years, was present for the conversation and said nothing during it. When Farrow stepped out to speak to his horse, Aldrich looked at Oliver for a long moment. "You should have done this 4 years ago," the sheriff said. "I know," Oliver said. "It'll go better than you think," Aldrich said. "Creed wasn't a man anyone in that county was sorry to lose." The witnesses Farrow's been interviewing have given a picture of a man who was long overdue for judgment. Self-defense is going to read well in front of a reasonable circuit judge. "You running was foolish and scared, but you were 24 and it was dark and the man was dead." He paused. "You're still going to have to sweat through the process." "I know," Oliver said again. He came out of the sheriff's office into the cold December afternoon and found Opal standing on the opposite boardwalk, her coat buttoned to the chin, her gloved hands folded. She had waited. He had not expected her to wait. He crossed the street. "Well," she said. "I told him everything," he said. "There'll be a process, a deposition, possibly a formal review by the circuit judge. Aldrich thinks it'll come out all right, but I have to go through it." She nodded slowly. "What happens in the meantime?" he asked. "Between you and me, what happens?" She looked at him for a long moment in the gray December light. "You keep earning it," she said. "That's what happens." He exhaled. It was not a relief exactly, there was too much still uncertain for relief, but it was a direction, it was a path. And Oliver Hadley had always been better with a clear path. He began. Earning it was not, as it turned out, composed of grand gestures. Opal Dawson was not a woman who required spectacle. She required something more difficult, which was consistent honesty, the daily, undramatic discipline of being exactly who you were instead of who you thought someone needed you to be. She required him to be present in the full sense of the word, with no compartments and no managed versions of himself. He started by simply talking. He talked about his father and the ranch and what it had meant to him growing up, and he talked about Creed and Galloway and the specific texture of the guilt he had been carrying for 4 years. He talked about the loneliness of the past years and why he had built his life the way he had, not because it was right, but because it was manageable. He talked about what he wanted, which was more difficult and more important than anything else, because wanting was a form of vulnerability that he had been avoiding for a long time. She listened to all of it. She asked questions when she had them. She pushed back when she disagreed with his framing of himself. She would not let him be the villain of his own story entirely, and she would not let him minimize himself into comfortable self-flagellation either. She held him to an accuracy about himself that was more demanding than simple forgiveness and more sustaining than simple judgment. She also, bit by bit, told him more about herself. He learned that she had come from a St. Louis family that had expected her to marry a particular kind of man and live a particular kind of life, and that she had been deeply unsuited to both. Her father had been a lawyer, her mother a woman of social ambition, who had not known what to do with a daughter who wanted to teach rather than be displayed. There had been a man once whom her family had pushed toward her, a respectable attorney named Cartwright who had been kind enough and had not the slightest interest in who she actually was. She had refused the match and come west, and she was not sorry. She was also, she admitted to him with a kind of careful honesty that mirrored his own, not entirely without fear that she had been too stubborn, that the life she had chosen was smaller than the life she had imagined, that Kansas was beautiful but very far from everything familiar. "Do you regret coming?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "No," she said, "I don't." The deposition to Marshal Farrow was filed in January. Oliver traveled to Wichita to appear before the circuit courts, reviewing magistrate on a gray morning in the middle of the month. Opal did not come with him. He had not asked her to, understanding that this was something he had to do himself, that she could not bear this for him. But she was standing on the platform when his train came in, 2 days later, with her coat collar up against the January wind, and her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes on his face with an intensity that told him exactly how much she had been waiting. The circuit court had reviewed the evidence. The accounts of multiple witnesses from Galloway and the surrounding area had been gathered, and they uniformly described William Creed as a man who had used the law and violence together as instruments of extortion. Mrs. Enright's case was part of the record. The magistrate had concluded that the incident constituted a case of self-defense under Kansas territorial law, and that Oliver Hadley bore no criminal liability for the death of William Creed. He was, however, officially noted as having failed to report the incident and having withheld information during an earlier inquiry, and this was formally reprimanded in the court's record. He was free. He stood on the platform of Redemption Creek Station and told Opal what had happened and watched the last 3 months of tension leave her face in a single slow exhalation. "Thank God," she said quietly. "Opal, don't you dare apologize again," she said. "You've accounted for it. You did what you should have done. Now it's done." "It's done," he agreed. She reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had initiated a physical gesture since November, and the warmth of her gloved hand in his, in the cold of a January morning on a train platform in Kansas, was the most specific and particular relief he had ever felt. "What now?" he said. "Now," she said, "you still have something to earn." He started to smile, and it was a different smile than the ones he had been making all these months, less careful, less managed. A real one. "I'm aware," he said. "Good," she said. "Let's get out of this cold." February on the Kansas prairie was not kind. The wind came off the plains with a determination that was essentially personal. The Double H hunkered under it, and Oliver drove to town more than was strictly necessary for ranch business. And Opal Dawson graded papers in her room at the boarding house with a quilt around her shoulders, and thought about things that were becoming increasingly difficult to think about with full clarity, because they involved the future, and the future had Oliver Hadley standing in it with a very specific solidity. He began taking her to see the ranch. He had not done this before, had kept the Double H as a separate part of himself, the part that was his father's and therefore also in some sense sacred, and also somehow too revealing. But he drove her out one Sunday afternoon in February, when the sky was the clean hard blue that only came in winter, and showed her the land. It was more than she had expected. The ranch was a working operation, but it was also, she could see it immediately, a place that had been built with care. The house was solid and larger than she had imagined from the outside, 2 proper stories with a covered porch running along the front. The interior organized and clean in the way of a man who lived alone but respected the space he inhabited. She walked through the rooms and he followed her, watching her look at things, his father's books on the shelf, the stone fireplace his father had built, the window in the kitchen that looked west toward nothing but grassland and sky. "This is a remarkable house," she said finally. "My father built most of it," he said. "I know," she said. "I can tell." He showed her the barn where Chet was mucking stalls and tipped his hat at her with the carefully neutral expression of a man trying not to express the enormous approval he clearly felt. He showed her the pastures where the cattle were moving slow and steady through the winter grass. "You love this place," she said. It was not a question. "I do," he said. "It shows," she said. She was looking at the western horizon, at the vast flat sweep of the land. "It must be very lonely." "It was," he said. "Less so lately." She turned and looked at him. "Oliver," she said. "Opal," he said. They stood in the February cold in the yard of the Double H, and Oliver Hadley, who had spent 4 years being careful and managed and solitary, took a breath. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not now, I know that's not where we are yet, and I know I still have things to earn, but I want you to know that it's where I intend to get. I want you to know what I'm working toward, because I think you should be able to decide if it's worth your patience, knowing what the destination is." Opal was very quiet for a long moment. "That," she said finally, "is the most Oliver Hadley way of not proposing that I have ever heard." He looked slightly pained. "I realize." It's also exactly right, she said. Because you're correct, we're not there yet, but I appreciate knowing the direction. She paused. I will tell you this, the destination does not seem to me to be without merit. He exhaled. That's the most Opal Dawson way of not accepting a proposal I've ever heard. She smiled, that real smile, the whole face one. We're well matched, she said. We are, he agreed, and the simplicity of agreeing to it out loud without hedging or fear felt like something opening. March came in rough, with storms that kept the cattle close and kept Oliver from town more than he liked. He sent letters. Long ones, with the careful, earnest handwriting of a man not naturally given to written expression, but committed to doing it anyway. He told her about the ranch in storm weather, about what the prairie looked like under a blizzard, about finding 3 calves in a drift and carrying them by hand to the barn. He told her about his father, about specific memories. Thomas Hadley teaching a 10-year-old Oliver to read the weather from cloud patterns, the smell of his father's pipe on Sunday evenings, the way Thomas had spoken about Oliver's mother, who had died when Oliver was 4, as if she were still present in the house, still part of the air. Opal wrote back with equal length and equal care. She told him about the children she taught, about a boy named Sam Fitch who had arrived in her class unable to read, and who was now, by March, the most enthusiastic reader in the school. She told him about a girl named Clara, daughter of one of the smaller homesteaders, who she suspected had remarkable mathematical ability, and who she was determined to see educated beyond a one-room schoolroom regardless of what the girl's father thought. She told him about her own childhood memories of St. Louis, the smell of the river in summer, the weight of a proper corset at a formal dinner, the precise quality of trap she had felt at those dinners surrounded by exactly the life her parents wanted her to want. The prairie does not feel like a trap, she wrote in one letter. It feels like the opposite. Some days I walk out to the north of town, and the land goes on in every direction without a wall or a fence, and I think, this is what was missing. He read that letter 3 times, and then folded it very carefully and put it in the box where he was keeping all of them. Spring arrived gradually and then all at once, the way it did in Kansas, and by April the prairie had gone from brown to green in what felt like 2 days, and the world opened up again. In April, on the anniversary of Opal's arrival in Redemption Creek, Oliver asked her to marry him properly. He did not make a large event of it, because he knew her well enough by now to understand that a large event was not what she wanted. He came to the boarding house on a Thursday evening and brought her 3 things: the complete collected works of William Shakespeare in a single volume he had ordered from a bookseller in Chicago, a small ring that had been his mother's, a thin band of gold with a single garnet set in it, and a very direct question. "Opal Dawson," he said, "I love you. I have been earning your good opinion for the better part of 4 months, and I intend to continue doing so for the rest of my life, but I would like to know whether you'll consent to doing the rest of it at the Double H with me, as my wife." She looked at the Shakespeare. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "You brought Shakespeare," she said. "I thought you'd appreciate the literary component." "I do," she said, "very much." She held out her left hand. "Yes, Oliver, I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He had not expected it to fit and was briefly overwhelmed by this small logistical miracle, and she laughed at his expression and said, "It's a good omen." And he said, "I'll take all the omens I can get." And then she stopped laughing because he was looking at her with an expression that was stripped of all its usual careful management, entirely open, entirely certain, entirely his. He kissed her in the sitting room of Mrs. Calloway's boarding house with the spring evening light coming through the windows, and when they separated she was still smiling, and the garnet on her finger caught the light, and he thought, this is what was missing. They were married in June of 1883 by Reverend Alcott in the church at Redemption Creek. The whole town came. Mrs. Calloway wept openly and without embarrassment. Chet Briggs wore a suit that Oliver suspected Chet had purchased specifically for this occasion, having never seen Chet in a suit in 6 years. Denny and Sampson, the ranch hands, sat in the back and tried to look as if they were not moved by the proceedings and failed entirely. Sheriff Aldrich stood in the doorway because there were no more seats. Opal wore a dress the color of cream with a high collar and small ivory buttons, her dark hair pinned up with a spray of prairie wildflowers that she had collected herself that morning, green eyes calm and clear, and fixed on Oliver's face with an expression that was both utterly composed and not composed at all if you looked closely, if you were the person she was looking at. Oliver looked at her and forgot, briefly, everything that he had prepared to say, which was fortunate because the vows were written and he didn't need to remember them. He said them steady and clear with his hands around hers and meant every word with a precision that had nothing managed about it. "I will love you honestly," he said, slightly off script when the formal words were done. "That's what I can promise. That's what I want," she said. "That's all I want." Reverend Alcott pronounced them husband and wife, and the church erupted in the genuine, uncomplicated happiness of a small community witnessing something good, and Oliver Hadley kissed his wife in front of everyone, which was not something he would have expected himself to do, and Opal kissed him back without the slightest self-consciousness. And outside the Kansas sun was enormous, and the prairie was green and the world felt, for one extraordinary June afternoon, entirely capable of being what it should be. They moved Opal's things to the Double H that week, which was a revelatory process. Oliver had not quite grasped the full scope of Opal's book collection until it arrived in crates on a wagon and had to be integrated into his father's bookshelves, which required the creative problem-solving of two people with slightly different ideas about organization. "Alphabetical by author," Oliver said. "By subject first, then author within subject," Opal said. "That seems complicated." "It means you can find what you're looking for more efficiently. I know where everything is already." "You know where everything was," she said pleasantly. "This is new information requiring a new system." He thought about this for approximately 4 seconds and then began reorganizing the shelves by subject. She made the house different, not changed exactly. She was not the kind of woman who needed to remake another person's space, but she added things that had not been there. A large map of the territories pinned carefully to the wall of the study, with pins marking various things she found interesting or important. An herb garden in the kitchen window. A rocking chair on the front porch that had not been there before, from which, in the evenings, you could watch the western sky go through its slow catalog of color. Oliver found himself coming home from the range earlier than he used to. Chet noticed this without comment, which was Chet's form of speaking volumes. Summer on the Double H that first year of their marriage was, there was no other word for it, good. It was genuinely, straightforwardly, uncomplicated good, which Oliver had not had much practice with and which he accepted with a gratitude that was occasionally so large he did not know what to do with it. Opal continued to teach through the fall. She had no intention of stopping, and Oliver had not the slightest desire to ask her to. And on the days when she was in town at the school, he worked the range and thought about her and came home in the evenings to find her reading on the porch, or writing in her journal, or cooking something in the kitchen that smelled like civilization. They talked every evening. This was perhaps the thing Oliver had least expected about marriage and valued most: the simple, daily conversation of two people who were genuinely interested in each other's minds. They argued about politics and history, and the territorial government's approach to education funding, and whether a particular passage in a particular book meant what the author intended or something else entirely. And these arguments were some of the most enjoyable things Oliver had experienced in his life, because Opal was serious and precise, and completely willing to be wrong when she was wrong, which was not very often, and completely unwilling to concede a point when she was right, which was almost always. He told her once in the fall of that first year that arguing with her was one of his great pleasures. "You say that as if it should be surprising," she said. "From me it is," he said. "I don't generally enjoy arguments." You enjoy honest disagreement, she said. That's different from argument. Most arguing is people trying to win. What we do is both of us trying to be right, which occasionally means losing. I think you find losing acceptable when it's to someone worth losing to. He stared at her. What? She said. Sometimes, he said. I don't know how you understand me better than I understand myself. I pay attention, she said simply. You're interesting when you're not hiding. I'm not hiding anymore, he said. No, she agreed. You're not. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned hers to meet it. And that small, easy gesture of a man and a woman at a table on an October evening was not a grand thing and was exactly everything. In the spring of 1884, Opal told Oliver she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast. In the direct way she told him everything important, sitting across the table from him with both hands around her coffee cup and her green eyes steady. I'm expecting, she said. Oliver put down his fork. He looked at her. He was quiet for a moment, and then his face did something that she described later privately in her journal as the most unguarded expression she had ever seen from him, an expression of such pure, uncomplicated joy that it was almost difficult to look at directly, the way certain kinds of light were. He stood up and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in his. Are you well? He asked, and his voice was careful in a different way than it used to be careful, not careful to conceal, but careful because she mattered. I'm perfectly well, she said. A little tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely well. He pressed his forehead against their joined hands. It was not a thing he would have done a year ago, that particular gesture of undefended tenderness. He did it now without thinking because she had made him into a man who could. A baby, he said quietly. A baby, she confirmed. God, he said, and there was nothing in the word except wonder. The pregnancy progressed well through the summer. Opal taught through most of it, reducing her hours as the fall came on, arranging for a neighboring woman, a Mrs. Patterson who had some education, to manage the school 2 days a week while Opal prepared her detailed lesson plans. She was magnificent about the whole thing, sensible and unsentimental about the physical realities, clear-eyed about what she would need, specific in her communications with the doctor in town, who was a young man named Dr. Reeves who had come to Redemption Creek that spring and was, Opal said, competent and good, which was more important than charming. Oliver was less calm about it. This was not visible in any dramatic way. He was not a man for dramatic demonstrations of anxiety, but Opal could tell by the slight increase in his evening check on the fire, by the way he restocked the medicine chest at the house twice in 3 months, by the fact that he had a letter from Dr. Reeves with a list of emergency instructions folded and placed in 3 separate locations around the house so it could be found quickly. She found this endearing and also, when she teased him about it, produced an expression from him that was half embarrassment and half pure determined love. You're allowed to be worried, she told him. You don't have to pretend you're not. I'm not worried, he said. Oliver, I'm being thorough. You have medical instructions in the kitchen, the barn, and inside your hat. That seems like he stopped. That seems like too many, he admitted. She laughed and he pulled her against him and rested his chin on the top of her head, and they stood in the kitchen of the Double H while the October wind came around the corners of the house, and he held his pregnant wife and was not managing anything, not hiding anything, just standing in the present, which was more than sufficient. Their son was born in November of 1884, on a Sunday, in the room they had made ready for it, with Dr. Reeves present and Mrs. Calloway, who had come at Opal's request because she had been something like a mother figure to Opal during her time in the boarding house. The labor was hard and long, and Oliver sat outside the door of the bedroom for 7 hours and was, by all accounts from Chet and Denny, who came to the house to wait, the least composed version of Oliver Hadley that either of them had ever seen. When Dr. Reeves opened the door and said, "Mr. Hadley, you have a son," Oliver Hadley stood up and walked into the room and saw his wife, exhausted and luminous, and holding a small red-faced person wrapped in white linen, and it was the most important sight he had ever encountered in his life. "Come here," Opal said, and her voice was tired and warm and certain. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put their son in his arms, and Oliver held the baby with the extremely careful posture of a man holding something he would not risk dropping, and the baby opened his eyes dark, unfocused, completely unimpressed by the significance of the moment, and Oliver said nothing at all for a long time. "What are you thinking?" Opal asked. "That I almost didn't have this," he said. His voice was rough. "That I almost, but you didn't," she said. "You chose differently." "You made me choose differently," he said. "I told you to earn it," she said. "You did the rest." He looked at her, she looked at him. Between them, their son blinked slowly and yawned with an authority that suggested he found all of this somewhat less urgent than the adults around him did. "Thomas," Oliver said. "After my father." "Thomas," Opal agreed. "It's a good name." Thomas Oliver Hadley came into the world at Redemption Creek, Kansas, in November of 1884, and grew into a round and surprisingly opinionated infant who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn stillness, and who made the double H into something it had not been since Oliver's father was alive, which was a home that was full. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No years were. There was a drought in the summer of 1885 that stressed the cattle operation, requiring Oliver to make hard decisions about herd size and water allocation. He made them with Opal's input, which he had come to value as much as Chet's. She had a clarity about priorities and a freedom from sentiment about assets that complemented his own deeper attachment to the land. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Graves over the purchase of a piece of adjacent land that Oliver wanted for expanded pasture, and Graves had decided, somewhat perversely, to also want. This dispute went on for several months and was eventually resolved through the mediation of Sheriff Aldrich in a manner that gave Oliver most of what he needed. And Oliver came home from the final meeting with Graves in a state of contained irritation that Opal dissolved by setting a plate of apple pie in front of him and sitting across the table and saying, "Tell me every insufferable thing he said," which he did, at considerable length, and felt considerably better by the end. There was the matter of Clara, the mathematically talented girl from the school, who at 16 had attracted the attention of her father's ranch foreman in a way that Opal found deeply inappropriate and dealt with by going to the father directly, with Oliver beside her for support though not for speaking, and presenting the situation with the cool precision of someone who had thought through every possible response in advance. The father, to his credit, took it seriously. Clara went to a women's seminary in Topeka the following year on a small scholarship that Opal had spent 6 months arranging, and wrote back to Opal regularly for years afterward. There was the matter of Sam Fitch, the boy who had learned to read in Opal's class, who came to Oliver at 17 looking for ranch work, and who Oliver hired and who turned out to be one of the best natural horsemen on the Double H, which was saying something given that Sampson had been at the ranch for years and was exceptional. The school grew. Opal pushed the territorial government until she got funding for the second classroom. She hired a second teacher, a young woman named Miss Holt, and they ran the school together for several years until Miss Holt married and moved to Dodge City, and then Opal hired another. In 1886, their second child was born. A daughter this time, arriving in April when the prairie was in its first green, with black hair and Oliver's gray eyes and an expression of such concentrated assessment from her very first days that Oliver said she looked as if she were already deciding what needed to be improved. "She gets that from you," Opal told him. "I've been told I'm improving," he said. "Continuously," she agreed and kissed him, and he caught her by the waist and did not let her go as quickly as she expected, and she rested her head on his shoulder in the way she had so natural, so unhesitating, so different from the first careful months of them. And he stood still and held his wife in the spring light of the kitchen at the Double H. They named the girl Eleanor, after Opal's grandmother, and she grew up bright and fierce and deeply interested in everything. particularly in her father's method of managing the ranch and in her mother's method of managing the school, which she studied with an approach that suggested she intended to synthesize both and add improvements. Thomas and Alina grew up at the Double H knowing how to ride, how to read weather, and how to think carefully about what they wanted before they said it. They grew up watching their parents argue productively and then agree, watching their father come home in the evening and sit with their mother on the porch in the last light and talk the way people talked who genuinely wanted to know what the other person thought. It was an unremarkable thing in the best possible sense, the ordinary business of two people who had chosen each other thoroughly. Oliver and Opal were not perfect. Oliver still tended toward a certain controlled stillness when he was uncertain, and Opal still had a directness that occasionally caught people off guard and needed contextualizing. There were disagreements that were not fully resolved by bedtime and mornings that were quieter than others. There was the ordinary friction of two strong people inhabiting a shared life, but there was no hiding. That was the thing. There was no hidden motive, no managed version, no compartment where one part of him lived away from her. He had made a promise on a doorstep in December of 1882 that was less a promise than a direction. He was going to earn it. And he kept earning it not through dramatic gestures but through the daily practice of being honest, being present, choosing her again in all the small ways that made up a life. In 1887, Oliver traveled to Galloway for the first time since that night in 1878. He went with purpose, to speak to Mrs. Enright's daughter, who still farmed that land, and to make a proper accounting of what he had done, not to the law this time but to the people affected. He paid a sum of money to Mrs. Enright's daughter that represented his best assessment of what had been unjustly taken from the family. He did not make a ceremony of it. He did it because it was right and because Opal had said once, in one of their evening conversations, that certain debts were not to the law but to the people harmed, and that meeting the legal debt and meeting the human one were different acts. Mrs. Enright's daughter, a woman of about 40 named Ruth Enright Harris, received him with initial wariness that shifted, as he spoke, into something more complicated. She took the money. She said thank you. She said also, and this landed with Oliver with the precision of an old wound properly closing, that her mother had known someone had intervened the night Creed died, and had always believed it had not been an accident but a mercy, and that she had never wished it otherwise. Oliver drove home from Galloway on a clear fall day in 1887, through the Kansas grassland that rolled away in every direction without limit, and felt, for the first time in 9 years since that night in the barn, that the ground under him was level. He got back to the Double H after dark. The house was lit. Through the kitchen window he could see Opal at the table, reading, her hair down, a cup of coffee at her elbow. Thomas was presumably asleep. Alina, who was 1 year old and deeply committed to resisting bedtime, was almost certainly not, but the upstairs was quiet, which was promising. He came in and she looked up and said, "Well," and he said, "It's done." And she set her book down and looked at him with those green eyes that had been looking at him steadily for 5 years now and said, "Come here." He came there. She stood up and put her arms around him, and he held her in the kitchen of his father's house, which was now as much hers as it was his, and outside the Kansas night was very dark and very quiet except for the sound of the wind over the grass, and it was, Oliver Hadley thought, the most peaceful he had ever been. By 1890, the Double H had expanded to nearly double its original acreage, absorbing a neighboring parcel that Oliver purchased when the Hollies family moved north. Chet Briggs, now in his 40s, remained the foreman and had acquired over the years a kind of informal status in the household. Not family exactly, but something with the permanence of it. A man who had been present through enough of the Hadley years to be woven into them. He took a quiet pride in Thomas's growing competence with the cattle that he expressed by teaching the boy everything he knew without ever appearing to do so deliberately. Sampson retired in 1889, acknowledging finally that his back was not equal to the demands of a full working season, and took a room in town where he did odd jobs and occasionally came out to the ranch for Sunday dinner. Sam Fitch, now in his mid-20s, had risen from ranch hand to one of Oliver's most trusted workers, and had acquired in that time a particular friendship with Thomas that would last, by all evidence, considerably longer than either of them had years left to count. Opal's school had become, by 1890, one of the better-regarded frontier schools in the county. There had been an inspection by a representative of the Territorial Department of Education, who had arrived expecting the standard one-room operation, and left with a detailed report about a two-classroom facility with a lending library, a mathematics curriculum several grades above the territorial standard, and a teacher of unusual quality. Opal was requested to correspond with the department about her methods, which she did, at considerable length, and without any false modesty about what worked. She had also, over the years, taken an interest in the families of her students that extended beyond the schoolroom. Several of the homesteading families around Redemption Creek lived with the same precarious financial margin that had characterized Mrs. Enright's situation. The small farms that could be overwhelmed by a single bad drought or a single year of low cattle prices. Opal organized, with characteristic directness, an informal system by which families in difficulty could access credit from the town's more established residents, not as charity, which she understood to be frequently humiliating and therefore counterproductive, but as loans at honest terms, documented properly. Oliver provided the bulk of the capital and the legal documentation. Several families stabilized over the years through this mechanism, and one of them was the Fitch family, Sam's parents, who had been 2 bad seasons away from losing their homestead in 1885. Sam Fitch had never directly mentioned knowing about this, but he was a perceptive young man and Oliver was fairly certain he knew, and the quality of Sam's work at the Double H suggested it had been taken as a private debt of honor. The children grew. Thomas turned 6 in 1890 and was reading as voraciously as his mother and as silently as his father, processing books with an internal thoroughness that made him slow to speak about them and precise when he did. Eleanor turned 4 and was not silent about anything, had opinions about horses at 3, and by 4 had opinions about the proper management of the henhouse, which she expressed to Chet with the frank confidence of a child who had grown up watching her parents take each other seriously. Chet took Eleanor seriously too. He was not a man accustomed to the company of small children, but Eleanor had simply assumed she was worth listening to, and eventually Chet agreed. He built her a small step stool so she could see over the top of the fence into the nearest pasture, and she stood there on weekend mornings telling him which of the cattle she thought looked well and which she had concerns about, and he listened with more attention than he would publicly acknowledge. In the spring of 1891, their 3rd child arrived, another son. They named him James, for no ancestor in particular, but because both Oliver and Opal had always liked the name, and had agreed on it within approximately 30 seconds of discussing it, which Opal said was a record for their jointly negotiated decisions. James was a different child from the start, louder, more immediately expressive, with a social instinct that had apparently skipped both his parents. He smiled at everyone. He cried loudly when he wanted something and stopped the instant it arrived, suggesting he regarded the whole system as a communication device rather than a genuine distress response. He was, Oliver said, the most efficient person on the property. Opal laughed and said that given the property included Oliver, that was a significant statement. "I'm efficient," Oliver said, with the particular dignity of a man who has been gently teased for enough years to have made his peace with it. "You are extremely thorough," Opal agreed, patting his arm in a way that was utterly fond and not entirely unlike the way one patted a very competent large dog. He caught her hand and held it, and she looked up at him, and they were standing in the kitchen of the Double H again with a baby on her hip and two older children audible somewhere upstairs in a discussion that was edging toward disagreement. And the late afternoon light was coming through the window over the herbs she had planted there 8 years ago. And Oliver Hadley looked at his wife and felt the same thing he felt every time he looked at her with full attention. That this was the sum of his life, and it was more than he had ever expected to deserve and exactly as much as she had insisted he earn. "I love you," he said. He said it simply and directly because he had learned from watching her that simple direct statements were underused and efficient. "I love you too," she said, equally simply. "Obviously." "Obviously," he agreed. Outside, the Kansas evening was going through its colors, the amber and rose and deep blue that Opal had described once as the prairie's daily argument for why it was worth living in. The cattle were moving toward the barn. Somewhere Chet was calling something at Denny's replacement, a young man named Pete who was good with horses and improving. Thomas would be coming in from wherever he had spent the afternoon soon. Eleanor would appear demanding to know what was for supper. James would need feeding in approximately 20 minutes based on his established schedule. It was an ordinary evening on the Double H in the spring of 1891. It was also, and simultaneously, the specific particular world that Oliver Hadley had almost destroyed through cowardice and had rebuilt through the sustained, daily, intentional practice of honesty and presence and love, because a woman on a doorstep in December of 1882 had looked at him and said, "Earn it." He had. Years later, when Thomas was grown and running a portion of the ranch and Eleanor was away at the Topeka Seminary, on a mathematics scholarship that Opal had orchestrated with the same systematic determination, she had applied to Clara's scholarship 12 years earlier, and James was 11 and deeply occupied with the question of whether horses or cattle were more interesting. And Oliver and Opal sat on the front porch of the Double H in the evenings watching the western sky in the rocking chairs that were both old now and thoroughly comfortable. Oliver said to her, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had let me ride out?" It was an evening in September. The air had that first edge of fall in it. The prairie grass had gone gold. Opal considered the question with the same honesty she brought to everything. "Yes," she said, "sometimes. Usually I think about how certain I was that you wouldn't." He looked at her. "You were certain." "Not completely," she said, "but mostly." She paused. "You had this quality even then, even when you were being impossible of a man who wanted to be better than he was. You could see it. And a man like that, when you give him a direction rather than a door, he'll take the direction." "You gave me a direction," he said. "I gave you an honest assessment and a challenge," she said. "You took it from there. You made it possible," he said. "You made it worth, Oliver," she said, in the tone that was not impatient but precise. "We made it. That's how it works." He was quiet. The sky was doing its evening thing. Somewhere down in the yard James was talking to the horses in a way that strongly suggested at least one of the horses was going to end up in the barn with an unauthorized quantity of grain if no one intervened. "James," Oliver called. "I'm not doing anything," James called back, which was such a precise replica of his sister's childhood approach to innocence that both his parents smiled without looking at each other. The Kansas evening settled around the Double H, around the house that Thomas Hadley had built, and his son had built further, and his son's wife had made into a home, around the pastures and the barn, and the fence line that had been mended and extended and mended again, around the life that two people had made from an honest confrontation and a challenge, and the daily decision to meet that challenge honestly. Opal reached over in the dusk and found Oliver's hand on the arm of his rocking chair, and he turned his hand to meet hers, and they sat together in the September evening on the front porch of the Double H, and the prairie went on in every direction without a wall or a fence, all the way to the horizon, all the way to the endless open sky of Kansas, and it was, exactly and entirely, everything. The years had given them much and asked much in return. The drought years had been hard. The years of illness, A winter when Thomas had a fever that had kept Opal at his bedside for 4 days, and Oliver pacing the hall in a state of controlled terror that she only understood afterward. When Thomas was well, and the fear could be admitted, those years had taken something. The ordinary accumulations of loss and compromise, and the particular weariness of working land and raising children and maintaining a marriage over years rather than months, all of it had weight. But the weight was distributed. That was the thing, it was not borne alone. Oliver had been taught, precisely and with great patience, that the weight you carried with someone was not doubled but halved, and that the exchange was honest and sustaining rather than the careful transaction he had once believed was the most he could offer. He had earned it. Not once at a dramatic moment, but continuously in all the ways that did not make for stories, the morning conversations, the disagreements handled with honesty, the years of choosing to be fully present rather than safely hidden. The earning was not a thing completed. It was a practice, and it was the best thing he did. Opal Dawson Hadley sat on her porch in the September dusk of 1895 with her husband's hand in hers, and thought about the girl who had stepped off a train at Redemption Creek with a carpet bag and a letter of introduction, and a determination not to live a life arranged by other people's expectations. She thought about what she had found instead, not what she had expected, not what anyone in St. Louis would have predicted for her, but what had been more genuinely right than anything they had imagined. She had found a man who did not begin well and had chosen to become better. She had found a land that was difficult and beautiful and did not apologize for either. She had found work that mattered and children who would carry forward something worth carrying. She had found, in the particular span of a human life, the specific and irreplaceable thing that made it worth the living. The stars were coming out over Kansas, enormous and indifferent and magnificent in the way that only truly vast things were, and Opal Dawson Hadley looked at them and was not afraid of their enormity. She was, in the deepest and most certain place she possessed, simply glad. Oliver squeezed her hand in the dark. She squeezed back. Down in the yard, James Hadley, aged 11 and thoroughly committed to the unauthorized companionship of horses, was telling a gray gelding named General about the specific injustice of supper schedules, and the gelding was listening with the philosophical equanimity of an animal who had worked out long ago that the Hadley household was a place where you would be fed and cared for and taken seriously, and that this was more than sufficient. The house behind them was solid and lit. The ranch around them was quiet and ordered and alive. The sky above them was the full, extravagant black of a Kansas night with no walls to stop the stars. Oliver Hadley, cowboy rancher, once a man who ran from difficult truths and had chosen, at the instruction of the most direct and honest person he had ever met, to stop, sat on his porch at the Double H and was content in a way that had no performance in it, no management, no hidden cost. He had been told he didn't deserve her. He had been told to earn it. He had spent 13 years finding out what that meant and doing it, and every year he understood better what she had given him by not letting him ride out, what she had trusted him with by demanding his best instead of accepting his departure, what it meant to be a man who was known completely and loved anyway. The stars moved in their slow circles over the Kansas prairie. The Double H endured, and in the best possible sense, in the only sense that finally mattered, everything was well.